The wind howled through the narrow streets of Florence as Lorenzo walked beneath the ancient stone arches, his mind heavy with the weight of recent betrayals. 3 months had passed since his business partners had orchestrated his downfall, stealing not only his investments but his reputation in the process. The man who had once commanded respect in the merchant quarters now found himself avoiding familiar faces, his confidence shattered like glass against marble. In his darkest hour, Lorenzo discovered a leather-bound manuscript tucked away in a forgotten corner of the Santa Maria Novella library. The pages, yellowed with age, bore the unmistakable seal of Niccolò Machiavelli. As he opened the tome, the first words seemed to leap from the parchment: "The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others." These words would become the foundation of his transformation, though he could not have known it then. The manuscript revealed 3 fundamental pillars of mental and spiritual fortification, each building upon the other like the stones of a fortress. Machiavelli had written extensively about political power, but this hidden work delved deeper into the psychology of strength itself, not merely the acquisition of external power, but the cultivation of an unassailable inner citadel. Part 1, The Architecture of Inner Destruction. The first pillar, Lorenzo learned, was the complete and ruthless examination of one's weaknesses. Machiavelli argued that most men live in comfortable delusions about their own capabilities and character. They construct elaborate justifications for their failures, blame external circumstances, and refuse to confront the uncomfortable truths about their nature. This self-deception, while temporarily comforting, leaves them perpetually vulnerable to those who understand their true weaknesses better than they do. Lorenzo began to apply this principle with surgical precision to his own life. He spent sleepless nights cataloging every moment of weakness that had led to his downfall. His need for approval had made him trust too easily. His desire to be liked had prevented him from asking hard questions about his partner's motivations. His fear of conflict had silenced him when he should have spoken up about irregularities in their accounts. Each revelation was like a dagger to his ego, but Machiavelli's words echoed in his mind: "Better to be the surgeon of your own soul than to allow others to be its executioner." The process of inner destruction, according to the manuscript, must be total and unflinching. Machiavelli wrote of observing condemned prisoners who, in their final hours, achieved a strange peace by accepting complete responsibility for their fate. They had stopped fighting reality and, in doing so, had found a peculiar form of strength. The man who destroys his illusions about himself gains something invaluable: clarity of vision unclouded by wishful thinking. Lorenzo discovered that this inner destruction was not a single event but a continuous practice. Each day brought new opportunities to catch himself in small self-deceptions, minor justifications, or comfortable lies. He learned to welcome these moments of recognition rather than shrink from them. The merchant who had once prided himself on his diplomatic nature now saw clearly how his diplomacy had often been mere cowardice dressed in prettier clothes. The manuscript detailed specific exercises for this process of self-destruction. One involved writing a brutally honest assessment of one's failures without any mitigating circumstances or external blame. Another required seeking out criticism from those who had witnessed one's weaknesses firsthand. Machiavelli himself had written such assessments during his exile from Florence, dissecting his own political miscalculations with the same analytical rigor he applied to studying Caesar and Borgia. As Lorenzo practiced these exercises, something remarkable began to happen. The anxiety that had plagued him since his business collapse started to diminish. When a man has already destroyed his own illusions about himself, the opinions and attacks of others lose much of their power. The criticism that once felt like arrows now seemed like mere observations of already acknowledged facts. The fear of exposure evaporated when there was nothing left to hide from oneself. The first pillar also involved understanding the psychology of one's enemies and competitors. Machiavelli observed that those who attack others are often projecting their own unexamined weaknesses onto their targets. The business partners who had betrayed Lorenzo, he realized, were driven by their own insecurities and fears. Their aggression came from a place of weakness, not strength. By understanding this, Lorenzo began to see their actions not as reflections of his inadequacy, but as manifestations of their own psychological frailties. This understanding transformed his relationship with conflict entirely. Where he had once seen personal attacks as verdicts on his worth, he now saw them as information about his attackers.
The emotional sting of criticism was replaced by analytical curiosity.
When former associates whispered about his failures in the marketplace, Lorenzo felt no urge to defend himself because he had already accepted and analyzed those failures more thoroughly than his critics ever could. The manuscript revealed that this process of inner destruction served another crucial purpose: it freed tremendous mental energy that had previously been devoted to maintaining false self-images. Lorenzo found his mind sharper, his decision-making clearer, and his emotional reactions more measured. The cognitive load of self-deception had been enormous, though he had never recognized it while carrying that burden. Machiavelli wrote extensively about how this principle applied to leadership and influence. The leader who has destroyed his own illusions can make decisions based on reality rather than wishful thinking. He can accurately assess both threats and opportunities because he is not distracted by the need to maintain a particular self-image. His followers sense this authenticity and respond with greater trust and loyalty than they would give to someone obviously engaged in self-deception. Lorenzo began to notice this effect in his interactions with others. As he became more honest about his own limitations and past mistakes, people paradoxically began to trust him more, not less. His acknowledgement of his failures, rather than destroying his credibility, actually enhanced it. Others sensed that someone who could see himself clearly was also more likely to see them clearly, and this made him a more valuable advisor and partner. The first pillar culminated in what Machiavelli called the Great Liberation. This was the moment when a person fully accepted that they were responsible for their own circumstances, good or bad. This acceptance was not self-flagellation or despair, but rather a recognition of personal agency. If one's current situation was largely the result of one's own choices and character, then different choices and character development could create different results. For Lorenzo, this liberation came on a rain-soaked evening as he stood on the Ponte Vecchio, watching the Arno flow beneath the ancient stones. The weight of blame, both self-blame and blame toward others, simply dissolved. He was responsible for his failures, yes, but that also meant he was capable of creating his own success. The victim mentality that had paralyzed him for months was replaced by a sense of empowerment that felt almost intoxicating. This transformation was visible to others. The defeated man who had slouched through Florence's streets began to carry himself differently. His voice grew steadier in conversation. His eye contact became more direct. Most importantly, he stopped seeking sympathy or validation for his past sufferings. The energy he had been pouring into maintaining his victimhood was redirected toward planning his resurrection. The manuscript warned that this process of inner destruction would be met with resistance, both from within and from others. The ego fights viciously against its own dissolution, creating elaborate schemes to maintain cherished illusions. Friends and family, accustomed to one's old patterns of self-deception, might feel uncomfortable with the new honesty and try to pull the individual back into familiar dynamics. Lorenzo experienced both forms of resistance. His mind constantly tried to revert to old patterns of blame and justification, especially when he felt stressed or threatened. Some of his remaining friends seemed almost disappointed by his refusal to continue wallowing in self-pity. They had been comfortable with their role as consolers and advisors to a defeated man. His transformation disrupted these established relationships. But Machiavelli's guidance proved invaluable during these challenges. The manuscript emphasized that the process of inner destruction must be protected from well-meaning interference. Those who have not undergone this transformation themselves cannot understand its necessity or value. Their attempts to restore the old self, however kindly intended, must be firmly but politely resisted. The first pillar concluded with a profound insight about the nature of human strength. Traditional notions of strength often involve building up defenses, accumulating resources, or developing skills to overcome opposition. But Machiavellian strength begins with subtraction, the removal of illusions, false hopes, and self-serving narratives. Only when these obstacles to clear thinking are eliminated can true strength begin to develop. Lorenzo found this principle revolutionary. His previous attempts at self-improvement had focused on adding new skills, knowledge, or connections to his existing foundation. But that foundation had been rotten with self-deception. Machiavelli showed him that lasting strength required first destroying the weak foundation and, then, building anew on solid ground. As winter gave way to spring in Florence, Lorenzo completed his work on the first pillar. The man who had begun this journey as a victim of circumstances now understood himself as the primary architect of both his failures and his future success. The weak self that had been vulnerable to manipulation, betrayal, and defeat had been systematically destroyed. In its place, something new was beginning to emerge. Part 2, the fortress of strategic thinking. With the weak self destroyed and clarity of vision achieved, Lorenzo was ready for the second pillar of Machiavellian mental fortification, the development of strategic thinking that could not be outmaneuvered by others. The manuscript revealed that most people live reactively, responding to events and other people's actions without any coherent long-term plan. This reactive approach leaves them constantly vulnerable to those who think strategically. Machiavelli's conception of strategic thinking went far beyond simple planning. It involved understanding the deeper patterns of human behavior, the hidden motivations that drive actions, and the long-term consequences of decisions that others might not foresee. The strategically minded individual learns to see several moves ahead in the complex game of human interaction, anticipating responses and preparing counter-responses. Lorenzo began his study of strategic thinking by analyzing his own past failures through this new lens. His business collapse had not been a sudden catastrophe but the predictable result of a series of strategic errors. He had failed to understand his partner's true motivations, ignored warning signs of their duplicity, and positioned himself in a vulnerable situation without adequate safeguards. Most damaging of all, he had allowed emotions rather than strategic thinking to guide his major decisions. The manuscript detailed several key components of strategic thinking. The first was the development of what Machiavelli called the long view, the ability to see beyond immediate circumstances to long-term patterns and consequences. Most people, driven by immediate needs and emotions, make decisions that solve short-term problems while creating larger long-term difficulties. The strategic thinker reverses this approach, sometimes accepting short-term discomfort to achieve superior long-term positioning. Lorenzo practiced this principle by reassessing his current situation through a strategic rather than emotional lens. His immediate instinct was to seek quick solutions to his financial difficulties, perhaps by taking any available work or accepting unfavorable partnerships. But strategic thinking revealed that such desperate moves would likely perpetuate his weakened position. Instead, he chose to endure continued hardship while carefully rebuilding his reputation and resources according to a coherent long-term plan. The second component was the study of human nature in its rawest forms. Machiavelli argued that most people present carefully constructed facades to the world, hiding their true motivations and weaknesses. The strategic thinker must learn to see through these facades to understand what really drives people's behavior. This understanding allows for accurate prediction of others' actions and the development of appropriate responses. Lorenzo began observing the people around him with new eyes. He studied the merchants in the marketplace, watching how they interacted with customers, suppliers, and competitors. He noticed patterns, how fear drove certain decisions, how pride led to predictable mistakes, how greed created exploitable vulnerabilities. These observations were not made with cynicism but with scientific curiosity. Understanding human nature was simply a tool for navigating reality more effectively. The manuscript contained detailed case studies of historical figures who had mastered strategic thinking. Caesar's approach to building alliances, Borgia's methods of consolidating power, and even Machiavelli's own political maneuvers during his time in the Florentine government. Each case study revealed the same principle: those who understood human nature and thought strategically could overcome opponents with superior resources but inferior planning. One particularly illuminating example involved Machiavelli's analysis of how the weak can defeat the strong through superior strategy. A smaller city-state could defeat a larger one not through direct confrontation but by understanding the larger state's weaknesses, perhaps internal divisions, overconfidence, or predictable patterns of behavior. Lorenzo began to see how this principle applied to his own situation. His former partners, despite their current advantages, had revealed character flaws during their betrayal that could potentially be exploited. The third component of strategic thinking was the development of patience and emotional discipline. Machiavelli observed that most strategic errors stem from emotional reactions rather than logical calculations. The leader who responds to insults with immediate retaliation, or who pursues opportunities without careful analysis simply because they appear attractive, will inevitably be outmaneuvered by those with greater emotional control. Lorenzo found this aspect particularly challenging. His natural temperament was passionate and immediate. He preferred action to contemplation and quick decisions to careful analysis. But the manuscript provided specific exercises for developing strategic patience. One involved forcing himself to wait 24 hours before responding to any significant provocation or opportunity. Another required him to list at least 3 possible outcomes for any major decision before acting. These exercises gradually transformed his decision-making process. Where he had once acted on instinct and emotion, he began to pause and analyze. This analytical approach revealed nuances and possibilities that his emotional responses had missed. He discovered that his first instinct was often wrong, or at least incomplete, and that better options became visible with careful consideration. The manuscript also emphasized the importance of information gathering and analysis. The strategic thinker must become a student of his environment, constantly collecting and analyzing information about competitors, allies, opportunities, and threats. This intelligence gathering must be systematic rather than casual, focused rather than random. Lorenzo developed a personal intelligence system, keeping detailed notes about the people he encountered and the patterns he observed. He tracked the success and failure of various business strategies in the marketplace, noting which approaches thrived and which led to difficulties. He studied the political currents of Florence, understanding how changing alliances and power structures might affect commercial opportunities. This systematic approach to information revealed opportunities that had been invisible to his less strategic younger self. He began to see gaps in the market that others had missed, understand which potential partners were genuinely reliable, and identify emerging trends before they became obvious to competitors. The strategic mind, he discovered, was largely a matter of seeing patterns that others missed because they were too focused on immediate concerns. The fourth component was the development of contingency planning. Machiavelli stressed that the strategic thinker must always prepare for multiple scenarios, including those that seem unlikely. The leader who has only one plan will be destroyed when circumstances change, but the leader with multiple contingencies can adapt to almost any situation. Lorenzo applied this principle by developing multiple paths forward from his current position. One plan assumed he would be able to rebuild his reputation quickly and return to his former level of business activity. Another assumed a longer rehabilitation period requiring different strategies. A third considered the possibility that his reputation might never fully recover, necessitating a complete change of direction. Having these contingencies removed much of the anxiety from his situation. Whatever happened, he had already considered various responses. This mental preparedness also made him more confident in his interactions with others. When someone suggested a particular course of action, he could quickly assess how it fit with his various scenarios rather than being caught off guard by unexpected proposals. The manuscript revealed that strategic thinking also involved understanding one's own limitations and working within them rather than fighting against them. Many people exhaust themselves trying to become something they are fundamentally not suited to be. The strategic thinker identifies his natural strengths and weaknesses, then positions himself where his strengths can be maximized and his weaknesses minimized. Lorenzo's honest self-assessment from the first pillar now served him well in developing strategy. He recognized that he would never be the most aggressive negotiator or the most naturally charismatic leader. But he was naturally analytical, good at seeing patterns others missed, and skilled at building trust through genuine concern for others' interests. His strategic positioning should leverage these strengths rather than trying to compensate for his limitations in other areas. This self-knowledge also helped him choose better allies and partners. Instead of trying to work with people whose strengths matched his own, he sought relationships where his abilities complemented others' skills. The strategic thinker, Machiavelli noted, multiplies his effectiveness by surrounding himself with people whose talents address his own limitations. The fifth component was the development of what the manuscript called strategic flexibility, the ability to change tactics while maintaining consistent long-term objectives. Many people confuse consistency with rigidity, sticking to approaches that are no longer effective rather than adapting to changing circumstances.
The strategic thinker maintains consistency of purpose while remaining completely flexible about methods. Lorenzo practiced this principle by clearly defining his long-term objectives, rebuilding his financial position, establishing a reputation for reliability and wisdom, and creating business relationships based on mutual benefit rather than mere opportunity. These objectives remained constant, but his tactics for achieving them evolved as he gathered new information and encountered changing circumstances. Sometimes this flexibility required him to appear inconsistent to others. Observers might not understand why he chose to be patient in one situation and aggressive in another, or why he formed alliances with people he had previously avoided. But these tactical changes were all guided by strategic consistency. Everything he did was designed to advance his long-term objectives, even when individual actions seemed contradictory. The manuscript warned that strategic thinking would often be misunderstood by others. People accustomed to emotional and reactive behavior might interpret strategic patience as weakness, strategic flexibility as dishonesty, or strategic planning as coldness. The strategic thinker must be prepared to be misunderstood and must not allow others' interpretations to drive him back into reactive patterns. Lorenzo experienced this misunderstanding frequently. Some former friends interpreted his new analytical approach as a loss of warmth and spontaneity. Others suspected that his careful planning indicated ulterior motives. But he had learned from Machiavelli that being understood by everyone was less important than being effective in achieving one's objectives. The second pillar culminated in what Machiavelli called the strategic mindset, a fundamental shift in how one approaches all situations. Instead of asking, "What do I want to do?" the strategic thinker asks, "What needs to be done to achieve my objectives, and how can I position myself to do it effectively?" This shift from desire-based to reality-based thinking was profound and permanent. For Lorenzo, this transformation was most visible in how he handled conflict and opposition. Previously, he had taken challenges personally and responded emotionally. Now he viewed opposition as simply another factor to be analyzed and managed. Competitors were not enemies to be hated but problems to be solved. Critics provided information about potential weaknesses in his approach rather than personal attacks to be defended against. This strategic mindset also changed his relationship with opportunity. Instead of pursuing every attractive possibility, he learned to evaluate opportunities based on how well they served his long-term strategy. Some apparently lucrative deals were declined because they would position him poorly for future moves. Some less immediately attractive options were pursued because they provided strategic advantages that would pay dividends later. As summer approached in Florence, Lorenzo had successfully internalized the second pillar. He now possessed not just clarity about his own nature and circumstances, but also the strategic thinking capabilities necessary to navigate complex situations without being outmaneuvered by others. The foundation was laid for the final and most crucial pillar of Machiavellian mental fortification. Part 3, The Unassailable Will. The third and final pillar revealed in Machiavelli's manuscript was perhaps the most profound, the development of an unassailable will that could not be broken by external circumstances or the actions of others. This was not mere stubbornness or rigid determination, but rather a sophisticated understanding of how to maintain inner strength regardless of external conditions. Lorenzo discovered that this pillar built naturally upon the first two. Having destroyed his weak self and developed strategic thinking, he was now ready to cultivate the kind of willpower that had made figures like Caesar and Alexander unconquerable despite facing seemingly impossible odds. The manuscript revealed that true strength of will came not from emotional intensity but from philosophical understanding combined with practical discipline. The first element of unassailable will was what Machiavelli termed philosophical immunity, the development of a worldview that rendered one largely immune to the psychological manipulations and pressures that controlled most people. This immunity came from understanding certain fundamental truths about human nature and the world that, once fully internalized, made manipulation nearly impossible. The manuscript outlines several of these philosophical foundations. The first was the recognition that all human situations are temporary and changeable. The person who fully understands the impermanent nature of both success and failure cannot be destroyed by either. Lorenzo had experienced this principle personally. His business success had been temporary, but so too would be his current difficulties.
This understanding freed him from the desperate attachment to particular outcomes that made most people vulnerable to manipulation. The second philosophical foundation was the understanding that other people's opinions, while sometimes useful information, had no power over one's fundamental worth or destiny unless one granted them that power. Lorenzo had spent years being controlled by his need for approval and fear of criticism. But philosophical immunity meant recognizing that others' judgments were simply expressions of their own psychological states and had no objective reality beyond that. This did not mean becoming indifferent to all feedback or social considerations. Strategic thinking still required careful attention to how others perceived and responded to one's actions. But the emotional charge was removed. Criticism became useful information rather than a personal attack. Praise became pleasant but not necessary for self-worth. The third foundation was the recognition that suffering and difficulty were inevitable parts of human existence rather than signs of personal failure or cosmic injustice. This understanding removed the victim mentality that made so many people vulnerable to those who promised to eliminate their suffering in exchange for submission or dependence. Lorenzo found this principle particularly liberating. His business collapse had initially seemed like evidence that he was fundamentally flawed or that the world was unfairly stacked against him. But philosophical understanding revealed it as simply one of the inevitable difficulties that any ambitious person would face. This reframing transformed his relationship with adversity entirely. The manuscript detailed specific practices for developing philosophical immunity. One involved daily reflection on the impermanent nature of all circumstances, both positive and negative. Another required studying the lives of historical figures who had maintained their principles despite extreme adversity. A third involved regularly contemplating one's own mortality, not morbidly, but as a way of maintaining perspective on the relative importance of daily concerns. Lorenzo incorporated these practices into his daily routine. Each morning, before engaging with the day's activities, he spent time reminding himself of these philosophical truths. This practice served as a form of mental armor, protecting him from the emotional manipulations and psychological pressures he would encounter throughout the day. The second element of unassailable will was the development of what Machiavelli called directional consistency, the ability to maintain movement toward one's objectives regardless of external pressures or temporary setbacks. This was different from rigid stubbornness because it involved tactical flexibility guided by strategic consistency. The manuscript used the metaphor of a river flowing toward the sea. The river encounters rocks, fallen trees, and other obstacles, but it doesn't stop flowing. Instead, it finds ways around, over, or through obstacles while maintaining its fundamental direction. Similarly, the person with unassailable will maintains consistent movement toward his objectives while adapting his methods to overcome whatever obstacles arise. Lorenzo applied this principle by clearly defining his fundamental direction, the creation of lasting prosperity through ethical business practices and mutually beneficial relationships. This direction remained constant even as his specific methods evolved in response to changing circumstances. When one approach proved ineffective, he adapted his tactics while maintaining his overall trajectory. This directional consistency was visible to others and had a powerful psychological effect. People began to see Lorenzo as someone who could be relied upon to move steadily toward his goals regardless of temporary difficulties. This reliability made others more willing to enter into long-term arrangements with him, knowing that he would maintain his commitments even when circumstances made them temporarily inconvenient. The third element was the cultivation of what the manuscript termed emotional sovereignty, complete ownership of one's emotional responses rather than allowing them to be dictated by external events or other people's actions. This did not mean suppressing emotions or pretending not to feel them, but rather understanding that emotional responses were choices that could be consciously directed. Lorenzo discovered that most of his previous emotional suffering had come not from events themselves but from his interpretations of those events. The betrayal by his business partners was painful, but the lasting damage came from the stories he told himself about what their betrayal meant about his worth, his judgment, and his future prospects. Emotional sovereignty involved taking responsibility for these interpretations and choosing more empowering stories. The betrayal could be interpreted as evidence of his poor judgment, or it could be seen as valuable education about human nature and business relationships.
The financial difficulties could be viewed as proof of his inadequacy, or as temporary obstacles on the path to greater wisdom and success. The manuscript provided specific techniques for developing emotional sovereignty. One involved catching negative emotional spirals early and consciously redirecting them toward more productive interpretations. Another required developing the ability to observe one's emotional reactions with detachment, like a scientist studying interesting phenomena rather than being overwhelmed by them. Lorenzo practiced these techniques diligently, and gradually found that his emotional responses became more measured and strategic. He still felt anger when treated unfairly, but the anger served his purposes rather than controlling him. He experienced disappointment when plans didn't work out, but the disappointment motivated better planning rather than paralyzing him with self-doubt. The fourth element was the development of resource independence, reducing dependence on external resources and validation to the point where one's fundamental strength could not be undermined by their withdrawal. This did not mean becoming a hermit or avoiding all relationships and resources, but rather ensuring that one's core capabilities and confidence were internally generated. The manuscript revealed that most people were psychologically dependent on external validation, financial security, social status, or other resources that could be withdrawn by others. This dependence made them controllable by anyone who could threaten these external supports. True strength required developing internal resources that could not be taken away. Lorenzo began systematically reducing his psychological dependencies. He had been dependent on others' approval for his self-worth. He now developed internal standards of evaluation. He had been dependent on external financial security. He now focused on developing skills and capabilities that could generate income in various circumstances. He had been dependent on his social status. He now found satisfaction in his personal growth and contribution to others. This process of reducing dependencies was initially uncomfortable. The external validations and securities that he was releasing had provided genuine psychological comfort. But, as his internal resources developed, he discovered that the internal supports were actually more reliable and satisfying than the external ones had been. The fifth element was what Machiavelli called adversarial immunity, the ability to remain focused and effective even when facing active opposition from others. This went beyond simply handling criticism or competition. It involved maintaining one's strategic objectives and emotional equilibrium even when others were actively working to undermine them. The manuscript analyzed how great leaders had maintained their effectiveness despite facing coordinated opposition from powerful enemies. The key was understanding that opposition was often a sign of effectiveness rather than failure. Those who posed no threat to others' interests rarely faced serious opposition. The person developing genuine strength and influence should expect to encounter resistance and prepare for it accordingly. Lorenzo found this perspective transformative. Previously, he had interpreted opposition as evidence that he was doing something wrong and had often retreated or changed course when faced with resistance. Now he understood that some opposition was inevitable and even desirable, as it indicated that his actions were significant enough to merit others' attention. This understanding changed how he responded to setbacks and attacks. Instead of taking them personally or allowing them to derail his plans, he analyzed them strategically. What did the nature and source of the opposition reveal about his effectiveness? How could he adapt his methods to overcome or work around the resistance? What opportunities might be hidden within the apparent obstacles? The manuscript emphasized that adversarial immunity did not mean being aggressive or confrontational. Often, the most effective response to opposition was strategic withdrawal, misdirection, or alliance building rather than direct confrontation. The key was maintaining the ability to think clearly and act strategically even under pressure. The sixth and final element was the development of what Machiavelli termed philosophical completeness, a comprehensive worldview that could provide guidance and strength in any conceivable circumstance. This was not religious faith, though it might include religious elements, but rather a practical philosophy that had been tested against reality and found reliable. This philosophical completeness served as the ultimate foundation for unassailable will. When a person had a coherent understanding of human nature, the patterns of success and failure, and his own role in the larger scheme of existence, he became nearly immune to psychological manipulation and despair. His actions flowed from deep understanding rather than emotional reaction or social conditioning.
Lorenzo spent months developing his personal philosophy, drawing from Machiavelli's insights but adapting them to his own experience and circumstances. He studied the great philosophical traditions, not as abstract intellectual exercises, but as practical guides for living effectively in a complex and often difficult world. His emerging philosophy emphasized several key principles: the importance of clear thinking over wishful thinking, the value of long-term strategic planning over short-term emotional satisfaction, the necessity of continuous learning and adaptation, and the fundamental responsibility each person bore for his own circumstances and responses. This philosophical foundation provided remarkable stability and confidence. When faced with difficult decisions, Lorenzo could refer to his core principles for guidance. When challenged by unexpected circumstances, his philosophical framework helped him maintain perspective and find appropriate responses. When attacked or criticized by others, his philosophical understanding protected him from taking these attacks more seriously than they deserved. The manuscript warned that developing unassailable will would fundamentally change one's relationships with others. People who had been accustomed to manipulating or controlling the old self would find their familiar tactics ineffective. Some would adapt to the new dynamic, but others might become hostile or withdraw entirely. Lorenzo experienced this transformation in his relationships. Some people, particularly those who had known him during his weakest period, seemed almost resentful of his newfound strength and independence. They had been comfortable with their role as advisors or supporters to someone in need. His self-sufficiency made their contributions less necessary. But new relationships also formed, often with people who respected strength rather than being threatened by it. Lorenzo found that his unassailable will actually made him more attractive as a partner and ally, because others could rely on his consistency and resilience even in difficult circumstances. The development of unassailable will also changed his relationship with risk and uncertainty. Previously, the possibility of failure had paralyzed him with anxiety. Now, understanding that setbacks were temporary and that his core strength could not be permanently damaged, he could take calculated risks with confidence. This willingness to take appropriate risks, combined with his strategic thinking and clear self-understanding, began to create new opportunities. People noticed his transformation and began approaching him with propositions and partnerships. His reputation slowly shifted from that of a defeated victim to that of someone who had overcome adversity and emerged stronger. As autumn returned to Florence, Lorenzo had completed his study and internalization of all three pillars. The weak self that had been vulnerable to manipulation and defeat had been completely destroyed and replaced with something far more powerful. Strategic thinking allowed him to navigate complex situations without being outmaneuvered. Unassailable will provided the inner strength to maintain his course regardless of external pressures. The transformation was so complete that he sometimes felt like a different person entirely. The anxieties and insecurities that had once dominated his thinking seemed like memories from someone else's life. The need for approval and fear of criticism that had once controlled his behavior had been replaced by internal standards and self-generated confidence. Most remarkably, the prediction embedded in Machiavelli's original phrase had proven true: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. Lorenzo's former partners, who had seemed so powerful when they engineered his downfall, now appeared as merely ordinary men driven by ordinary weaknesses. Their ability to harm him had depended entirely on his own psychological vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities no longer existed. The manuscript had revealed not just techniques for personal development, but a fundamental truth about the nature of human strength and vulnerability. External power, wealth, and resources could be taken away by circumstances or other people's actions. But the strength that came from clear self-understanding, strategic thinking, and unassailable will was truly one's own and could not be destroyed by any external force. Lorenzo's story became something of a legend in Florence's business community. The man who had fallen from success to apparent ruin had not only recovered but had achieved a level of effectiveness and influence that surpassed his original position. More importantly, his strength now rested on solid foundations rather than the shifting sands of external circumstances and others' opinions. The manuscript concluded with Machiavelli's observation that this transformation, while available to anyone willing to undertake the necessary work, would always be rare. Most people preferred the comfortable illusions of the weak self to the demanding clarity of strength. they chose reactive responses over strategic thinking and external validation over internal development. But, for those few who were willing to destroy their weak selves and rebuild on stronger foundations, the rewards were extraordinary. They became truly free in a world where most people lived as slaves to their own weaknesses and others' manipulations. They achieved a form of power that was both ethical and effective, based on understanding rather than force, wisdom rather than cunning. Lorenzo closed the ancient manuscript as the sun set over the Arno, its golden light reflecting off the water like scattered coins. The man who had begun this journey as a victim of circumstances now understood himself as the master of his own destiny. The weak self was dead and buried, and in its place stood something unassailable, not because it was protected by external walls, but because it needed no protection at all. The words that had begun his transformation echoed in his mind one final time: the man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others. He had proven this truth through his own experience, and the proof had set him free.